it's abundantly clear that the Islamic identity of Saudi Arabia for Mohammed bin Salman is not a central pillar to the identity of the Saudi state anymore. The reality is, for Mohammed bin Salman, he has put himself aligned with those who are arguing that Islam breeds extremism. Necessarily keen on maintaining an exclusive relationship with Saudi Arabia, that with this closer partnership between Turkey and Pakistan, with this increasing partnership between Pakistan and Iran, whether that's with regards to railways, whether that's with regards to increasing Islamic rhetoric from Imran Khan, whether that's with regards to Imran Khan's use of the OIC in order to try to force OIC countries into positions that they would not prefer to take ordinarily, or they would seek not to take in order not to upset the US or to upset other countries. There is this sense that Pakistan is really asserting itself in recent times, is really starting to impose itself and assert its own interests in a manner that perhaps Saudi Arabia believes threatens the relationship. You'll remember a couple of years ago in 2019, when Mahathir Mohamad of Malaysia tried to convene a conference of nations and states and the like, and Saudi Arabia threatened to withdraw investments in Pakistan if Imran Khan went to attend. In other words, this suggestion that for Saudi Arabia's perspective, Pakistan is drifting, Pakistan is going towards a different orbit that Saudi Arabia does not like, that Saudi Arabia believes is not in its benefit, even if perhaps it might benefit Pakistan in the long term. Moreover, we've seen a shift in attitudes in Saudi Arabia with regards to its perspectives on foreign policy. We no longer see an emphasis on focusing on OIC countries or Islamic countries or the like, but rather we're seeing Saudi Arabia through Vision 2030, through Mohammed bin Salman, in his words, opening up this idea that we will no longer be driven by a particular identity. And this is why we've seen closer relations now between the UAE and India, and now Saudi Arabia is following suit with India, opening the doors to India, despite Modi's aggressions against the Muslim population in India, despite the lynchings, despite whatever. For Mohammed bin Salman, this is no longer an issue necessarily of importance in Saudi foreign policy, and it is now about pursuing closer ties with India as a huge country, as a huge economy, as Saudi looks to diversify in its economy. It's important to note first and foremost that Saudi Arabia is going through a succession struggle, in that the kingship is moving from the second generation to the third generation of princes, and that brings about its own unique dynamics, in that the third generation of princes no longer know how the succession will take place after bin Salman. In other words, the kingship moved from brother to brother to brother to brother. This time it's moving to the next generation, so nobody knows how kingship will pass. Will it go from rely on the family? It has to rely on external support. The reason that's important is because it explains why bin Salman is so heavily keen in order to win over Washington, to win over Paris, to win over some of these Western states, in order to ensure that he has that support in order to become king. And part of that is to offer these reforms that remove the Islamic influences over Saudi Arabia. Bin Salman has rewritten history and changed the year of the establishing of Saudi Arabia from 1744 to 1727. In other words, removing the period in which Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and the Islamic fervor was involved in establishing the state, and making the starting point when Muhammad Al Saud was simply a small village head in the outskirts of Riyadh. We've seen bin Salman introduce giant raves in the desert. We've seen him introduce nightclubs. We've seen him introduce bikini beaches. We've seen him introduce all of these concepts. We've seen him imprison religious scholars. We've seen him essentially reduce in the education curriculum the hours that are spent on Arabic, Quran, and Islamic studies in favor of subjects that he calls critical thinking. It's abundantly clear that the Islamic identity of Saudi Arabia for Mohammed bin Salman is not a central pillar to the identity of the Saudi state anymore. Vision 2030 is about creating a Saudi Arabia where the Islamic influences are not dominant in the manner perhaps that they are today. And this is why for bin Salman, foreign policy or relations towards India should not be governed by this ideology, should not be governed by Islamic sentiment. Whereas Imran Khan has been moving very much increasingly towards the Islamic sentiment, whereas Erdogan in Turkey has been moving towards the Islamic sentiment, the UAE, Saudi Arabia have been moving in the opposite direction. And this is why for Mohammed bin Salman, when he's looking towards what's happening in India, he believes that he can squeeze Pakistan via its economic crisis and the fact that it relies on the investment coming from the Gulf. Therefore, he can go to India without compromising Pakistan. If Pakistan gets upset, they can squeeze it economically, and meanwhile they can establish ties with India, with Modi, set aside the Muslim issue, focus on the economic benefits, focus on the political benefits, in order to try to establish this wider Asian alliance that bin Salman believes he can really achieve, whether that's with India, with Japan, with Korea and the like. And as sad as it sounds, the reality is that bin Salman is making inroads. He's making, there is genuine developments in the relationship between bin Salman and India and elsewhere, in a manner that perhaps bin Salman doesn't appreciate, might actually impact Saudi Arabia's influence over the Muslim world in a negative way, not in the positive. So a very clear example in the manner in which Macron responded to the attacks that took place, the unfortunate attacks, the tragedy that took place in France when French citizens were killed. They were stabbed by a lunatic, by a lone wolf. But Macron decided to describe it as an Islamic terrorism phenomenon. What we saw in the reactions was abundantly clear. We saw Erdogan of Turkey shouting from the top of his lungs that this is unacceptable. We saw Imran Khan advocate and say that this is irresponsible, that it's wrong, that there should be initiatives geared towards changing this perception, and that Macron is fueling Islamophobia. And we even saw Imran Khan suggest setting up even a channel by which they can communicate more to the Western world to tackle this. But in contrast, we saw the UAE say that Macron has a right to protect the national security interests of France, suggesting that his initiatives in curbing the freedoms of the French Muslims was legitimate. We saw Saudi Arabia notably silent, notably quiet. It took them at least 1 week before they released a statement saying that they don't appreciate Macron's rhetoric, but it came very late, suggesting they did it reluctantly after Imran Khan, after Erdogan and the likes were really making a big scene out of it. The second example is with regards to the Palestine issue. In the last Israeli aggression against Gaza, in the last war that Israel waged against Gaza, we saw Pakistani media defending the narrative of the Palestinians. We saw Turkish media defending the narrative of the Palestinians, but we saw Saudi media essentially repeating the narrative of the Israeli media, suggesting that the problem was Hamas, the problem was the Palestinians, that they were the reason why the war took place. Essentially, this is the reason I give this example is because it directly links to your point with regards to India, in that when Israel bombs the Palestinians, Saudi appeared to side with the Israelis while giving official statements in the OIC of no meaning that they stand with the Palestinians. The action did not reflect the speech. Likewise, when it comes to India, we see the lynchings, we see the ban on hijab, we see the way that Modi is cracking down on the Muslim population. But bin Salman is still pursuing closer ties, still pursuing closer relations, preventing the OIC from issuing a clear statement on it, not engaging with efforts by Pakistan and by Turkey to host summits that perhaps seek to create a united front against these kind of issues. The reality is for Mohammed bin Salman, he has put himself aligned with those who are arguing that Islam breeds extremism. For Mohammed bin Salman, I think it's about gaining international support for these reforms that he's embarking on. Bin Salman believes that the reality is that the ideology that's been preached in Saudi Arabia is a common denominator amongst these various different terrorist groups that have popped up, whether that's Al-Qaeda or whether that's ISIS. The second point to note is that bin Salman is from a generation that I call the MBC generation, MBC being the television channel that imported the Hollywood films, that imported the American dramas and series to a Saudi population, essentially suggesting that success comes from these liberal ideas and that Saudi is backwards because of its current ideas, because of its Islamic ideas and the like. So bin Salman believes that part of opening up Saudi Arabia and achieving prosperity, and he may well believe this sincerely, is about removing the Islamic influences, opening up Saudi Arabia and moving away from this idea that La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah should be on the flag, and that rather the flag should be something else and the like. He believes that his Vision 2030 requires the input of international powers. He wants investment from India, he wants investment from Japan, particularly given that after the Khashoggi murder, the Western companies are less inclined to invest in Saudi Arabia, and also Western companies are more likely to set up base in the UAE, which is a more favorable financial environment than Saudi Arabia. And bin Salman was so upset about that he announced that any company that does not have its base in Riyadh cannot bid for government contracts. The idea being that he really wants Saudi Arabia to attract that investment, and he's struggling because the future now is in Asia, the future now is eastwards. Bin Salman wants to expand those ties. He's building ties with China, he's building ties with Japan, and India is part of that, expanding ties with India, a rapidly growing economy. And the reality is, for Bin Salman, a few Muslims being killed by Modi is not sufficient to compromise the wider interest of economic benefit. Pakistan, first and foremost, is that it is a country that is surrounded by fires, but feels that it is chained in its ability to assert its legitimate interests in these various different issues, that its economy is hamstrung by the economic crisis within Pakistan, that it's heavily reliant on China, that the US has been trying to squeeze Pakistan because Pakistan has been trying to assert its interest, or at least try to build a buffer between it and between the fires in Afghanistan or India or all these other different places. The US is upset that Pakistan has tried to assert its interests over those of the US, and that Pakistan has essentially tried to say to the US that, although you are in Afghanistan, we suffer the burn from your actions, and therefore you should listen to us and you should listen to what we have to say. And Pakistan, of course, behind the scenes has pursued its own policy that the US believes to be outrageous and quite frankly ill-disciplined. And this is why we see this very cold relations today between Pakistan and between the US. Pakistan believes that as it stands, it's the say that it has, or the influence that it has, does not reflect the size of the country and its importance, and that's because of the economic crisis. And this is why we see that Pakistan tries to operate within these constraints, asserting itself in Afghanistan by establishing channels and connections with the Taliban in order to remain relevant in Afghanistan, establishing ties with Turkey. When Saudi pushes, Pakistan retreats a little bit. When Saudi Arabia relaxes, Pakistan goes again and tries again. Pakistan already is doing a great job of riding the waves. But the issue is whether the Pakistani population can establish enough stability for the likes of Imran Khan, or indeed for the likes of whichever Pakistani leader emerges after Imran Khan, to be able to adopt a long-term vision to secure that independence that is necessary to compete.